In this lecture, we will survey the historical and literary context for Franz Kafka's The Metamorphosis. Franz Kafka was born in 1883 in Prague, Czechoslovakia to a Jewish family, but he grew up speaking German, writing in German, and earning a law degree from the German University in Prague, the city's elite being German. He lived a difficult life, which has been traditionally discussed as a result of his strained relationships with his father, women, and jobs. From a young age, he felt overshadowed and intimidated by his father, a successful businessman, who Kafka described as, quote, a true Kafka in strength, health, appetite, loudness of voice, eloquence, self-satisfaction, worldly dominance, endurance, presence of mind, and knowledge of human nature. Kafka himself struggled with his self-confidence and image, and desperately wanted to please his father, who it seems he could never impress. When he died in 1924, it was a sad day for German literary artists and writers of Prague, especially the German Jews of the city. About 100 mourners gathered for his funeral, including Dora Diamant, his lover, who earnestly uttered endearments to Kafka's corpse, though he could no longer hear her, and when Dora let out a cry and collapsed next to his grave, shocking everyone into a stillness, his father took the opportunity to simply turn around and walk away, prompting others to tend to the poor, fainted woman. Kafka also struggled with his sexuality, alluding at times in his writings to impotency and concerns about sexual failure. He blamed his father, who appeared always at ease with the subject of sex, for neglecting to endow him with a proper sexual education. He wanted to prove his sexual prowess, and frequented brothels as an adult. His complicated feelings on sex are inseparable from his anxieties about marriage. He was engaged several times in his life, but never married. In his diaries, he wrote that he believed, quote, coitus was the punishment for the happiness of being together. Moreover, he felt family life would stifle his creative endeavors, that it would, as he wrote to the father of his then-fiancée, quote, tie his creative hands behind his back. He was likewise frustrated by the series of tedious jobs he had to take just to subsist, as these also cut into his time for writing. Yet even though most recognize writing as Kafka's greatest addiction, even his works did not liberate him from the anxieties and acute self-consciousness that plagued him in all other aspects of life. Upon his death, he commanded his friend and eventual biographer Max Brod to destroy his remaining manuscripts, a command Brod did not heed, instead protecting Kafka's works from the Nazis and publishing them posthumously. Although the bio-introduction in our Norton anthology states that Kafka was a handsome man, Kafka was repulsed by his body. It is generally agreed that he suffered clinical depression. He was occasionally suicidal, had social anxiety, and may have suffered from anorexia. In 1917, after the publication of Metamorphosis, he was diagnosed with tuberculosis, and 7 years later he died of starvation, the tuberculosis making it too painful for him to swallow anything to eat. He disliked doctors, feeling that they treated him reductively, as an illness to be treated rather than a human, yet at the same time he resented them for not being able to cure him. In the end, when we look at Kafka's literature now, we look at how he used his suffering as a resource for his writing. Kafka brings us to modernist literature. At this time, across the globe, we're seeing a boom in new technologies and sciences. The ability to move people and information across great distances, sometimes almost instantaneously, with the telegraph, telephone, steamships, railroads, automobiles, and airplanes, as well as the ability to care for booming populations with advancements in agriculture and medicine that improved nutrition, public health, and infant mortality, resulted not just in industrialization and urbanization processes we see emerging over the course of the 19th century, but mass production as well. Capitalism is on the rise. It's replacing the value systems embodied by the ideologies of humanism, which had dominated Western society since the Renaissance. With capitalism, we see the commodification of meaning, life, and people. For instance, capitalism promotes mass-produced art and prints, and defines success by money over moral, ethical, spiritual, or intellectual value. Modernist artists rebelled against the rise of capitalism by critiquing institutions and the loss of values. In this way, some see modernism as an extension of romantic individualism and the nature of rebellion cultivated in the early 19th century. Urbanization and globalization also impacted the arts. While populations boomed and cultures began making contact worldwide, people began feeling increasingly alienated. Amid the masses, one can feel lost, alone, and disconnected, and that's exactly what we see happening here. Modernist artists then turned inwards to examine their self-consciousness and the impossibility of defining themselves in this increasingly meaningless world, rather than examine society and the insistence of moral and intellectual meaning as traditional realists had. Another way of looking at this is as a crisis of representation and reason. Modernists looked at the advancement of sciences and technology and saw how, on one hand, they unwittingly made horrifying things like commodification and war more efficient, while on the other hand counterproductively stripped emotional and spiritual meaning from the universe. As we saw with the naturalists and Ichio, if life is nothing but a condensation of atoms and chemical processes, then even that which we call reason, to which artists turned during the Enlightenment to perfect humankind, lead to progress, and save cultures from barbarity, actually demeans our pursuits of meaning. For reason dictates that the universe is naturally and inherently meaningless. In this way, reason no longer appears rational. It's a crisis of reason. Likewise, reality no longer appears real. This is the crisis of representation. Because reality is stripped of meaning, it no longer feels familiar or human, but distant, alien, confusing, and ultimately inhuman. Everything is mass-produced. Laborers are cogs in a machine. Patients are churned out of emerging hospital institutions. Tear gas and machine guns make mere numbers of men. Reality isn't personal, and it doesn't make sense. Thus, just as some have said modernism is the new romanticism, others have said modernism is the new realism, as it insists that reality should be defined anew as being very unreal in aspect. In Germany, for instance, the estrangement effect theorized by Bertolt Brecht rebels against the emotionally manipulative techniques made possible by advanced cinema technology and sets, which facilitated the horrifyingly popular early 20th century propagandistic films that supported, for instance, white supremacy in America or the Nazi movement in Germany. Instead, this estrangement effect presents alternate techniques to make critical thinkers of its viewers. Brecht describes this thus, quote, "The artist's object is to appear strange and even surprising to the audience. He achieves this by looking strangely at himself and his work. As a result, everything put forward by him has a touch of the amazing. Everyday things are thereby raised above the level of the obvious and automatic." In other words, the point is to make the audience think about the art. Some of you may be familiar with the fourth wall as an example of this concept. The concept of a fourth wall derives from theater, where the back of a stage and its left and right walls comprise three walls, the invisible wall between the stage and audience making the fourth wall. Normally, a play proceeds without acknowledging the audience. The fourth wall is intact. But when an actor or actress somehow acknowledges the audience, maybe they make a meta joke or address the audience directly, they've broken the fourth wall. Deadpool constantly shows awareness that he's a comic book character, thus breaking the fourth wall. When he recognizes Stan Lee by his real name, for instance, he's broken the fourth wall between fiction and reality. When characters in film look directly at the camera, they're breaking the fourth wall. The estrangement effect of literature then distances audiences from the reality constructed by the art in order to allow greater reflection. This kind of modernist literature rebels against the capitalist nature of early 20th century art by turning audiences into producers of meaning rather than consumers of meaning. So rather than engulf ourselves or wrap ourselves up in our emotions as we did with Romanticism, audiences now are supposed to ponder intellectually about characters' actions and behaviors. Another response to the crisis of reason and representation in modernism was Surrealism. Surrealism is an aesthetic movement that values spontaneous and subconscious expressions as opposed to rational and conscious statements. The idea is that the concept of reality as some rational, objective expression is not enough anymore. As discussed earlier, reality is now dictated by irrational rationalities. People justify things through cutthroat, means to an end, or cost-benefit analyses, all self-serving arguments that are presented as though they are objective truths. Think of big brand companies performing supposedly scientific studies to prove that their product is environmentally safe or nutritious. This is an example of irrational rationalities. So surrealists felt that it's time to get away from these lies, and they asked, what if the dream reality is actual reality? We think dreams don't make sense, but in actuality, the reality we're currently in doesn't make sense either. So maybe the real reality is in our dreams. Proof of this is in things like slips of the tongue, when our subconscious seems to slip through, and the ease by which it seems we all slip into disorientation. Our bodies and minds seem predisposed or inclined to return to this truer reality. The dream reality is also such a perfect reality. You can do whatever you want as much as you want without consequence. The goal, then, of surrealism is to unite our dreams with our supposed reality to bring the real dream out. As Kafka says, quote, "The dream reveals the reality, which conception lags behind." While our conscious, rationalizing minds fail to make sense of the world, our liberated subconsciousnesses are capable of making sense of the world. A textbook example of surrealist art is Salvador Dali's The Persistence of Memory. If one were to try to find a rational meaning behind this painting, one could say, as critics have said, that Salvador Dali is dismantling the concept that space and time are uniform and constant concrete concepts, instead presenting the ideas that space and time are relative. This would suggest that Salvador Dali is taking creative license with Albert Einstein's theory of special relativity. However, when asked what inspired his painting, Salvador Dali replied that he thought only of camembert cheese melting in the sun. That is an example of a surrealist liberating himself from rational meaning. In Kafka's The Metamorphosis, we'll examine how he makes use of both the estrangement effect and surrealism to comment on humankind's modern condition.